I've been looking at John 1, verses 17 to 34, which is about John the Baptist testifying about who Jesus is. But I'm particularly looking at John 1:29, where he gives his famous saying, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." Now, John the Baptist was a big deal. He was someone in their culture who was highly regarded as a prophet of God, who was sent by God to give a message by God. He seemed to have great credibility in that culture and in that era. And so John, the author, is trying to bring John the Baptist to a place where he's showing that John the Baptist, I'll shorten it with J the B. I know you maybe think that's a little weird, but it saves time. To how J the B was fully endorsing Jesus as the Messiah and not making anything of himself. And so the author is trying to get J the B's to show that he endorsed Jesus fully. To me, it's sort of like what we see happening in our era, where it seems that Joe Biden is clamoring after the endorsement of Taylor Swift, thinking that if he can get Taylor's endorsement, it will swing millions of voters in his direction. So the religious leaders come to talk to J the B because he is so highly regarded and is so outspoken as a messenger from God. They come to find out who he is. And so they come to him, and the first thing they ask is, "Are you the Messiah?" And because that's what John has been talking about, John the author has been talking about, is that the Messiah has come to us. That's what chapter 1 is about. And he has come into the world, and the world was made by him, and as many as received him, and this word became flesh, and he is the Messiah, and the Messiah has come. And so these religious leaders come to J the B and say, "Are you the Christ?" Because they're searching for the Messiah. And John, of course, says, "No, I'm not." And then they say, "Well, are you Elijah then?" Because Elijah was expected to come sort of when the Messiah came. And he said, "No, I'm not even Elijah." And then they say, "Well, are you the prophet?" And by that they're talking about the prophet from Deuteronomy 18 that was prophesied by Moses to come. And many scholars and people of the day thought that the prophet was a messianic figure. So they say, "Well, are you at least the prophet?" And John says, "No, I am not any of these things that you're asking about." See, J the B was trying very hard to get out of the way so that Jesus would be seen. John the Baptist knows he has a role to play. He knows that God has given him a task to do. But he is essentially saying, this isn't about me. It's about the Messiah. And they say, well, if you're not the Messiah, and you're not Elijah, and you're not the voice, and you're not the prophet, then who are you? What are you doing? And John then quotes a prophecy from Isaiah saying, "I am the voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Messiah, prepare the way for the Lord." He says he's here to point out who the Messiah is. And they say, well, if you're not the Christ, if you're not the Messiah, and you're not Elijah, and you're not the prophet, and you are here to point out the Christ, then why are you baptizing people? And it's at that point where J the B says, basically, I'm doing what I was given to do. I was ordained for a particular task. I was given a role. There's a way that I'm expected to serve, and that's what I'm doing. I'm just doing the job that I was given to do. But the one who deserves all the honor, he is not only coming, but he is actually walking in your midst at the present time. And that's where then we get this famous saying where then the next day he says, John saw Jesus, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Now, Now, scholars are coming at this saying from very different angles, and there are lots of different thoughts about what they say John meant by that. And the common one is that it's about Jesus' sacrificial role, possibly even as the Passover lamb. But I think it's different than that, because John the author has been trying to show us that the Messiah is coming into the world. And so I think when J the B says, "Behold the Lamb of God," he means that in a messianic sense, not a sacrificial sense. So let me talk about that a little and explain my reasoning. In verse 34, after this, Jesus sees John again. John sees Jesus again, and John again says, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." And this is the one who was before me. He is pre-existent God. And he is the one who's coming after me. Even if you look at verses 35, 36, when John again says, "Behold the Lamb of God." Disciples who have been following J the B now turn to follow Jesus, as if John is telling he is the messianic figure. He is the Messiah. And so they go and spend the day with Jesus. And afterwards they go to their friends and say, "We have found the Messiah." So I think this Lamb of God statement is somehow identifying that Jesus is the Messiah, not that he's the sacrificial lamb. John the author has been preparing us for this declaration. He's told us from the very beginning that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and this Word, all things were made by him. And this Word in verse 15 is the pre-existent one. He has existed from eternity past. It says the same thing in verse 30. That's John's point, that this Word is the pre-existing God who came into the world. Not just the pre-existing God, but who came into the world. And he says that in chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. He came unto the world, and the world was made by him, and the world did not know him. And it says in verse 14, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory." And the reason for the Messiah coming into the world, John the author wants us to know, the reason for the Messiah coming into the world is so that all might believe, and therefore have life and light through his name. And that's in verse 7 and verse 12. So this is John the author's point, is that Jesus is the Messiah. Not that he's the sacrificial lamb, not that he's the atoning sacrifice, but that he's the Messiah. Now, certainly he is the sacrificial lamb. Certainly he is the atoning sacrifice, but that's not John's point at this time. At this time, he's trying to establish that Jesus is the Messiah, the eternal God who has come into human life so that all might believe and have life through his name. That's the author's point. So when he brings in J the B's quote, I think that's what he's heading for. And before this, J the B is asked if he is the Messiah. And he says, no, it's his job as the forerunner to cry in the wilderness. It's his job to come before the Messiah and to identify the Messiah and to reveal him to all Israel. That's what he says when the reason I baptize is to reveal the Messiah to all Israel. Now, when you get to this specific text of John 1:29, we find out that, at least to me, this verse has an Advent feel to it. Because John, the author, has been talking about that this word is coming into the world. He came into the world. And in verse 14, it says he came into the world. And then here in verse 29, it has the same word and the same kind of feel to it, that Jesus is coming into the world. He says, as Jesus was approaching, that John saw Jesus coming. He is coming towards him. And so it's this Advent kind of feel that you get to it. Like in the Gospel of John, this is Jesus's first appearance. And so he has made his advent. He has come into the world. He has made his grand entrance. Jesus has come. Not only that, but then John says, when he sees Jesus, J the B says, behold, which gives to me the feel of a theophany. Behold, he is the light of the world. Behold, he is the gate. Behold, he is the bread of life. It gives this theophany kind of feel, like here is the burning bush. Behold, here is the the warrior in Joshua. Behold. It gives this theophany kind of feel to it. So I still think the saying in verse 29 pertains to identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And you go, but where does it make sense that a lamb is the Messiah? Well, in Jewish writings, just before this time, what we would call apocalyptic writings, apocalypse, the book of Revelation is an apocalypse, that which is being revealed, the revelation. In apocalyptic writings, just before this time, there's actually some writing that identify the Lamb as the warrior Messiah. The Lamb is the divine warrior Messiah. Now, we also see this same kind of thought in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse, in the book of Revelation itself, where the Lamb is not just the sacrifice, the Lamb who was slain, but the Lamb becomes the warrior Messiah, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who has come to destroy evil. Now, we see that in the book of Revelation, which comes after the Gospel of John in its writing. But I'm just telling you this kind of a theme, that this Lamb would be a warrior, was one of the thoughts of the era. And we know there is reasonable speculation that John the Baptist had some contact with the Essene community that also believed in the idea that the Lamb was a warrior Messiah, come to destroy evil. And I think that's what this verse means, that John the Baptist is not saying, here comes the sacrificial lamb who will atone for the sins of the world. In the context of John 1 and in their cultural context of the era, I think what John the Baptist is saying is, here comes the divine warrior Messiah who will destroy evil. And that's the point that John the author is trying to bring out, that John the Baptist was trying to bring out. Now, what makes me think this is true when there are so many other people that say, no, this is about Jesus being an atoning sacrifice? Well, actually, this idea, when I looked in some commentaries, actually shows up in Raymond Brown's Anchor Bible commentary on the book of John, where he takes the same approach, that John was saying that Jesus was the warrior Messiah, come to destroy evil, that the saying is not about his being a sacrificial Messiah, come to atone for the sins of the world. So why do I think it, regardless of what Raymond Brown says? I think it fits the context better. The context is all about Jesus as a pre-existing eternal God who has come into the world to bring light and life. And the quest of John chapter 1 is to find out who the Messiah is, and not just John 1, but John 2, John 3, John 4. It continues through the stories of calling the disciples, and Jesus meeting Nathanael, and Jesus meeting Nicodemus, and Jesus meeting the woman at the well. It's all about the quest to find out who the Messiah is that has come to destroy evil. And a sacrificial lamb atoning for sin doesn't fit that context as well. The context is about the eternal God coming to earth as the Messiah to reveal light and life. Now again, I will say that's not to claim that Jesus was not an atoning sacrifice to take away the sins of the world. He was. But I don't think that that's what this particular saying and text is about. And even the immediate passage following this text, after John says, this is the light of the world, This is the Lamb of God who has come to take away the sins of the world. He follows that verse with, and this is the pre-existent one that we've been talking about. And then in the text immediately following, when John again says, this is the Lamb of God, the disciples go and follow Jesus and declare their conclusion, I have found the Messiah. That's what this text is about, that they have found the Messiah. So I'm curious what you think of this idea. I think it makes more sense out of the text, out of the sequence, out of the saying. But feel free to talk with me about it in the comments below, and we'll have a good discussion.